welcome. I'm truly glad you're here. Wherever this finds you curled under blankets in the quiet blue of your room, walking slowly through dim streets with your thoughts as your only companion, or simply resting, eyes closed, letting the day fall away like silk from your shoulders, invite you to pause, to stop reaching, to stop thinking. There's nothing you need to do now but listen. There is no quiz at the end. There are no names you must remember, no years to memorize. This space is not about knowledge, it is about memory, rhythm, stillness. It is a space to drift, to rest, to wonder without urgency. If at any point sleep arrives, let it. You can return to the story later, or not at all, because tonight you're not here to study, you're here to surrender. And you're safe to do so. We begin not with battle nor crown, but with breath, with the hush before the first word, with mist rising from a river at dawn, unseen but present. The story of China stretches so far back that it ceases to be a line. It becomes something else, a pool, a spiral, a deep current whose surface barely ripples, but whose pull is ancient and insistent. It is not a single story, but many layered like brushstrokes on silk, like incense in an old temple, like memories passed between generations, not with voice, but with gesture. A bowl passed a certain way, a lullaby hummed without words, a silence that speaks of reverence, not absence. This is a story of 4,000 years, but also a story that happens in one quiet room, over and over, in the soft folding of dumplings, the sound of calligraphy gliding across paper, the ritual of tea poured slowly into a chipped cup. There are places in this world where time moves differently, where the clocks fail to tick, and instead the past lingers in corners like dust, woven into the wood grain of doors, the weight of fabric, the slope of old stone stairways. China is one of those places, not just as a nation, but as a sensation, as something you feel before you understand it. Here, time does not rush, it rests. It settles into bodies and language and weather. It hums in the low drone of temple bells. It flickers in candlelight reflected in polished ink. It is not loud, it is not linear. It folds back on itself again and again, whispering the same questions with different mouths. What does it mean to live, to honor, to endure? Long before the pyramids reached toward the desert sun, before Rome carved its roads into stone, before even the alphabet knew what shape it would take, China was already breathing. Along the muddy banks of the yellow river Wang, heat people began to listen to the stars, to plant seeds with ceremony, to bury their dead with care. The river moved slowly, but with purpose, carrying not just silt, but the early weight of memory. Children traced patterns in the soil. Elders spoke to ancestors whose names had become wind. The earth was not inert, it responded, and people learned not to dominate it, but to enter into rhythm with it, to wake with the rooster, to kneel at the hearth, to offer rice not for nutrition, but for meaning. To speak of China is to speak of a thread that is never fully snapped. In a world where kingdoms vanish in a season, where flags are replaced and languages erased, China has remained not unchanged, but unbroken. Its continuity is not just political, it is emotional. A memory passed not through conquest, but through ritual, through handwriting, through the preparation of food, through mourning and joy and the smell of sandalwood in winter. Here, the emperor was never just a man. He was the hinge between the visible and the invisible. He was tasked not with ruling people, but with holding balance. And when drought came, or the sky turned red, or the river rose too high, it was understood not as accident, but as rupture in that sacred alignment between the heavens and the human world. In this worldview, power is never permanent. It must be renewed through virtue, through reverence, through care. But this is not a story only of rulers. Not really. It is a story of poets whose names were forgotten, but whose verses remained tucked into drawers. Of fishermen who whispered to the river before casting their nets. Of women who wove silk not for sale, but for their daughters' future. Of scholars who lit oil lamps at midnight to copy ancient texts, line by line, stroke by careful stroke. Of children who fell asleep on wooden floors to the scent of steaming rice. These people, these millions of quiet lives, are the true heart of the story, the texture, the breath, the reason it endured. The dynasty may rise and fall, but the tea still boils, the ink still dries, the spirit remains. And through all things, through war and hunger, through invasions and revolutions, through reform and forgetting, China survived. It changed, it stumbled, it burned and rebuilt, it mourned and reemerged, it retreated inward and reached outward again. It has been both dragon and phoenix, both emperor and peasant, both silence and storm, but always, always, it has remembered something essential, that history is not only in books. It lives in the angle of a roof tile, the sound of a bamboo flute, the soft murmur of prayers whispered beside a grave. It lives in the pause between seasons, in the gap between characters, in the silence before a bell rings. So tonight we move slowly. We do not leap from date to date. We do not measure progress in wars won or treaties signed. Instead, we breathe with the centuries. We feel the stone beneath bare feet. We walk through ancient courtyards where rain once fell and still might. We drift down rivers that know more than we do. We listen to stories not as answers, but as lullabies. This is not a lecture, it is a reverie, a soft unfolding, a place to rest. And if you enjoy this way of learning, this gentle rhythm of history, told, not with urgency, but with stillness, you are warmly invited to support this space. Subscribe, share it with someone who needs rest, leave a kind word, but only if you are still awake by the end. This space is not for the algorithm, it is for the soul. So wherever you are in bed with the light turned low, seated on a train as dusk folds across the fields, or simply lying still in a quiet room, you are welcome here. You are part of this moment now. You are part of the scroll that continues to unroll. The candle is lit. The tea has been poured. Outside, the wind stirs gently through reeds. A bell echoes in the distance, and the river always, the river begins to speak. Let the journey begin. Let us begin slowly now. The world you enter is not loud. It does not announce itself with trumpets or banners, nor does it ask for attention. It simply is vast, still, and endlessly patient. You are standing at the edge of a wide plain, wrapped in the hushed embrace of twilight. The light is pale, silvered like old rice paper, and the wind carries with it the soft scent of damp soil and distant grass fires. A river moves nearby, not in haste, but with the slow certainty of something older than language. Its waters are thick with silt, the color of lowest dust and time. You watch as the surface ripples, not from boats or birds, but from the quiet rhythm of breath, your breath, and the breath of the earth itself. This is not yet China as we know it, not yet the country of emperors and calligraphy, of porcelain towers and stone dragons. This is something older, a wide land of contrasts, of silences, of beginnings without names. The mountains to the west rise like petrified waves, frozen mid-ocean. their peaks shrouded in mists that never lift entirely, only drift like memory along the ridgelines. To the north, the desert sings in whispers long, empty verses carried on dry wind that erases footprints in moments. The south is heavy with life, tangled with vines and water, lush with insects and birds whose songs echo through rice paddies and flooded terraces. And to the east, the edge of the land opens into sea, where tides murmur stories in salt and fog. But it is not the mountains or the forests that guide us now. It is the rivers, the great winding arteries of ancient time. It is here, where water meets land in 1,000 variations of flow and stillness, that history began to form its first thoughts. 2 rivers shaped the soul of this landscape, and we must sit beside each one in turn. The yellow river Wang, he's not gentle. She is restless, unpredictable, and utterly vital. Her waters are thick, almost granular, tinted yellow by the fine, powdery soil she carries from the highlands. This river is both giver and taker, mother and monster. For millennia, she has flooded and receded, destroyed and nurtured. Entire villages have vanished beneath her swells. And yet those same villages have always rebuilt, again and again, planting millet in her nourishing banks, tracing ancestral rituals in the damp earth. Her presence is not one of comfort, but of truth. She does not flatter, she reminds of cycles, of fragility, of dependence. To live beside her is to accept uncertainty, to wake each morning and thank the river for not rising too high the night before, to watch children play beside her with one eye on the water and the other on the sky. Further south lies the Yangtze Changjanga River, whose demeanor is different but no less powerful. She is wide, slow, deep. Her waters move not with force but with confidence, with the quiet momentum of someone who knows they will arrive eventually. Along her basin, the climate warms, the air softens, and the land opens into patterns of green and stone. Here, rice grows in mirrored terraces that glisten like scales under moonlight. Here, villages stretch in long ribbons along the water's edge, each home with its own set of wooden stairs descending into the shallows. The Yangtze does not roar. She hums, she invites. Her banks are lined with misty mornings, temple bells, and a low, steady thud of oars. The life she sustains is slower, more meditative fishermen pulling in their nets just before dawn, potters rinsing their hands in clay-colored water, elders sipping tea on carved balconies while the sun slides lazily through gauzy clouds. Together, these 2 rivers, the wild and the calm, the northern sorrow and the southern grace, form a kind of breathing, an inhale and an exhale that shaped not only the geography, but the psychology, the language, the soul of what would become Chinese civilization. They did not merely provide water, they shaped seasons, beliefs, meals, funerals, marriages. They became metaphors. They became mothers. And in their embrace, early humans began to imagine not just how to live, but why. And yet, before all that, before cities and dynasties, and even the faintest whisper of politics, there were stories. Long, winding stories told around fires, scratched into bark, hummed while kneading grain. Stories that explained not only the stars, but the hunger, the dreams, the rain. One told of a giant named Pangu, who split the world open with an axe, his breath becoming the wind, his body the very mountains we see now, silhouetted against dusk. Another told of Nuwa, a goddess who shaped humans from yellow clay and sang the sky back into place after it was torn apart. These myths were not indulgences, they were necessities. They gave meaning to hardship. They made suffering noble. They linked the flood and the harvest to something larger, something watching, something that might forgive. While the gods whispered in story, human hands were busy with smaller, quieter things. Clay pots, woven mats, bone needles. By 5000 BCE, communities had already emerged along the riverbanks. The Yangshuo people crafted red pottery with careful fingers, painting spirals and fish in black pigment under flickering firelight. Their homes were dug into the earth, rounded and warm, and they lived in a rhythm of seasons, gathering in autumn, storing in winter, waiting. The Longshan came after, with sharper edges, walled towns, signs of status. They buried their dead with offerings, blades, beads, bits of cloth folded like prayers. Even then, life was not seen as isolated. One's actions echoed, one's breath mattered, one's place in the cycle was sacred. Imagine the scene. A woman crouching by the hearth, pounding millet with a smooth stone as her child sleeps wrapped in wool beside her. A man weaving baskets from river reeds, humming the same melody his grandfather once hummed under a similar moon. Children chasing dragonflies through fields warm with afternoon light, the scent of boiled herbs drifting through the open door. These were not just people surviving. They were people remembering. People beginning to build a language of continuity. As we move forward now, slowly, into the first dynastic murmurings, we meet the Shire name caught between myth and memory. There is debate, doubt, absence of proof. But perhaps the Xia's truth lies not in what they left behind, but in what they made possible. The idea that there could be a lineage of rulers, that history could be recorded, that power could be passed, not just taken. The archaeological site at Erletu suggests something re-palatial, buildings, bronze, workshops, early roads. But perhaps more important is the gesture, the desire to organize time. And then, more certainly, the Shang who took questions to the gods and returned with cracks and answers. They asked the future with fire, etching characters into turtle shells, heating them until they split, reading those splits as guidance. In this sacred fracture was born writing, not just record, but invocation. The script was not for commerce, it was for communion. The Shang also crafted bronze not only for weapons, but for vessels, vessels that held wine, offerings, memory, objects so intricate they seemed made for gods rather than men. They honored the ancestors with these tools, setting them beside bones, lighting incense whose smoke wound skyward like a thread back to the dead. And the dead, they believed, were never truly gone. They listened, they judged, they lingered. When the Zhou came, they brought not just conquest, but a philosophy that would echo for over 2,000 years. The mandate of heaven. The idea that power was not permanent, but conditional. That a ruler who governed poorly, who neglected the people, who let the land suffer, he would lose heaven's favor, and with it, his right to rule. This was not just political theory. It was weather. It was flood and fire. It made the earth itself into a courtroom. It made rebellion holy. But that is a story for the next chapter. For now, let us stay here, beside the river Dot. The air is cooler now. A breeze stirs the reeds. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughs. Or perhaps it is only wind. You sit on a smooth stone, warmed by the day's last light. The water flows by, slow and certain, whispering secrets no one remembers and everyone carries. The night is long. The fire is soft. The story has only just begun. Let us move slowly now, not forward, but deeper. The river has carried us gently through the first murmurings of civilization, through mist and millet, through clay pots and whispered myths. Now It rounds a bend, and we find ourselves in a world more structured still, soft in its light, still quiet in its rhythm, but now shaped by ideas, not tools, not stones. Ideas. We are no longer in the time of mere survival. We have entered the time of thought, of structure, of harmony designed not by instinct, but by intention. You are standing at the edge of a city that does not rise in haste. It unfolds. The roads are long and straight, drawn with care between the fields. The houses are ordered, not grand, but balanced. There is space between things, space for wind, for reverence, for ritual. In the center stands a hall of ancestral tablets. Nothing inside moves, yet the air feels thick with presence. Red lacquer glows in the afternoon sun. Silk drapes like fog over doorways. And outside, the people move slowly, shoulders back, eyes lowered, as if the very ground beneath their feet holds memory. This is Zhou. The Zhou did not conquer merely with force. They conquered with a story, a belief, a rhythm that explained not only who should rule, but why. The mandate of heaven, Tianming, a phrase that sounds gentle but shaped empires. It did not claim divine right in permanence. It did not promise that a ruler would reign forever. Instead, it offered something far more fragile and more demanding: conditional trust. The idea that heaven, vast and unseeable, would grant power only to those who ruled with virtue, and that when that virtue failed, when corruption crept in, when famine went unaddressed, when the people suffered, the mandate would be silently, irrevocably withdrawn. No trumpet, no thunder, just silence and collapse. Imagine the weight of that responsibility. The emperor was not simply a king. He was the center of the world's balance. A single man, in his movements, his choices, his rituals, could tilt the scales of harmony. If he neglected the rites, the river might flood. If he raised taxes unjustly, drought might come. If he allowed cruelty to bloom, rebellion would rise like steam from the earth. The signs were not hidden, they were in the weather, in the stars, in the harvest, in the hearts of the people. To rule was not to command, it was to listen. And so the Zhou wove structure into everything. Not just government, but life. Feudal lords were appointed as stewards of regions, not to reign, but to maintain balance between heaven and earth. The state became a family. The family became a state. Each person had a role, and every role was sacred. Fathers did not merely lead, they modeled virtue. Sons did not merely obey, they honored a cosmic chain. Rituals multiplied. Bowing, speaking, eating, morning jacked carried meaning beyond its surface. A misstep was not just impolite, it was dangerous. It risked imbalance, chaos. And yet there was grace in this structure, a stillness. In Zhou life, time slowed. The seasons were watched with awe, not efficiency. Planting had a blessing. Harvest had a festival. Elders were not a burden, they were wisdom embodied. Children were not shaped by discipline alone, but by example. The sage did not shout, he wrote, he walked quietly, he bowed often. It is in this breath that a man named Kang Q was born. We call him Confucius, but to understand him, we must forget the statues, the quotes, the textbook summaries. We must imagine him as he was, a teacher, walking dusty roads with a few scrolls tied in cloth, offering guidance not for power, but for peace. His voice was not loud, his words were careful. He did not seek glory. He sought order not in the sense of obedience, but in the sense of wholeness. He taught that the foundation of all things, government, family, self, was Ren, humaneness, compassion, integrity, and that Li ritual was the container that held it. To Confucius, the emperor should be like the father of a household, leading by example, not fear. The ruler who governed well needed no harsh punishments, because the people, seeing his virtue, would reflect it back. Education was not for prestige, it was for cultivation. Learning was not accumulation, but refinement. Every poem memorized, every character practiced, was a softening of the soul. In this vision, history was not progress, it was return. The golden age was behind, not ahead. And to restore it, one must remember, not invent. Confucius looked backward with tenderness, not regret, and in doing so, created a future that endured for 2,000 years. Other thinkers followed. Mencius, who believed people were good at their core, like water flowing downhill, that all they needed was space, nourishment, time, and that a government's first duty was to feed its people, not praise the gods. He taught that rebellion was not evil, it was feedback. A ruler who lost the people lost the mandate. It was not treason, it was restoration. And Zunzi, sterner, slower, perhaps sadder, who argued that goodness was not natural but necessary. The people, like fields, would turn wild without discipline. That ritual was not constrained, was liberation. A way to rise above impulse, a way to enter the sacred rhythm of things. These were not debates, they were harmonies, different instruments in the same ensemble. Together, they formed the heart of classical Chinese thought, a philosophy not of conquest, but of conduct, not of gods, but of patterns, a path one walked, not followed. Let us pause here, in the quiet of a Zhou evening. The sun is low, the roofs glow orange. In a small home outside Luoyang, a mother teaches her daughter to grind ink on a stone slab. The scent of pine and charcoal drifts through the air. A candle flickers. A bowl of steamed grain waits by the bed. The night is slow. The father bows toward the household shrine. The child places her brush down carefully, the bristles soaked but clean. Nothing is said, and yet everything is happening. But harmony, once held, is not easily preserved. Over time, the system strains. Feudal lords grow bold. Their ties to the center weaken. They build armies. They fortify cities. The Zhou emperor, once the axis, becomes symbolic, revered in word, ignored in deed. The spring and autumn period begins, a time of polite fragmentation. States begin to act alone. Conflicts rise, not in open war, but in policy, in border disputes, in whispers. And then, eventually, the warring states. The bow breaks. Swords glint beneath the moon. Armies rise. Philosophy retreats into corners. Temples fall. The dream of unity dissolves in dust. But not entirely, because even in war, the scrolls are copied. The incense is lit. A mother still teaches her daughter to bow at the shrine. The mandate may falter, but the rhythm never disappears. It only waits. Let the day end now. Let the dust settle across the fields. Let the records be sealed, the ink dry. The wind moves gently across the palace eaves. Somewhere a bell rings, not to call to battle, but to mark the hour. The light dims, and still the mandate hovers fragile, eternal, listening. We move slowly now, not toward glory or collapse, but into the still, expansive center of something vast and deliberate. What rises before us no longer resembles a tale made of names or dates, but a living architecture, not a monument, not a legend, not a god, but a quiet and prolonged body made of straight roads, sealed decrees, bamboo slips, jars of grain, perfectly squared courts, officials dressed in grey. We are no longer in the time of sacred ritual or philosophical dreams. We are entering a new form of civilization, a machine that does not shout, does not pray, does not sing, but breathes. It has no single face, it has 1,000 hands. It speaks in parchment, it moves with the rhythm of an eternal calendar. After centuries of fragmentation, of warlords' screams, of maps drawn and erased with each spring, the unification brought by the Qin dynasty was more than a military victory. It was a structural decision, an imposition of absolute order over chaos. Emperor Qin Shi Huang not only gathered the scattered kingdoms under his authority, he imposed a singular way of counting, of weighing, of writing, of measuring the world. Coins were unified. The axles of carts were standardized. Units of distance, of volume, of farmland were carved into stone. Most importantly, a single writing system was established. Characters that every bureaucrat had to learn to copy precisely, so the state could read itself without confusion. The land was not allowed to flow like water. It was carved like sculpture. Mountains were tunneled, valleys leveled, trees cut, villages relocated, rivers forced to change course. This was no longer a nation. It was a grid imposed by will. The state was no longer an assembly of princes. It was a system in which every person had an assigned place, every function was recorded, and every movement was observed. Administration extended like an invisible net of scribes, messengers, accountants, judges, tax collectors. Power no longer resided only in the army. It lived in paper, in the red seal of official documents, in the name list carefully written by a rural official who would never meet the compeer emperor but obeyed his law with cold and exact devotion. When Qin Shi Huang ordered the construction of his tomb, he did not ask for a pyramid or a mausoleum. He ordered an underground city, a complete world beneath the earth, an army of terracotta warriors, each different, all silent, canals of mercury, ceilings painted with constellations, celestial maps buried beneath tons of soil. Death was not dissolution. It was the extension of order. But every structure too rigid begins to crack from within. The Qin dynasty, in its obsession with total control, exhausted the peasants with forced labor, the scholars with censorship, the soldiers with endless campaigns. Rebellions multiplied. The emperor died in a caravan, his corpse disguised in a box of fish. The empire that was meant to last 10,000 generations barely survived one, and yet what it left behind was not forgetfulness. It was a blueprint. The memory that it was possible to govern from the center. The design was not lost. It was picked up, examined, adapted. The Han inherited that structure and turned it into breath. They did not destroy the machine, they humanized it. They wrapped it in silk, returned the voice of Confucius, transformed obedience into ritual, law into ethics. The emperor remained absolute, but he was no longer only force. He was symbol. He was expected to embody virtue, to sacrifice solemnly, to consult ancient books, to listen not only to his ministers, but to the sky. Government became choreography, a living encyclopedia. Officials were chosen not by birth or favor, but by knowledge. The exam system began in childhood. A boy learned the characters of the Book of Rites, of the Spring and Autumn Annals, of the Analects of Confucius. He copied verses onto wooden tablets that others had copied centuries before. His calligraphy was not just aesthetic, it was conduct, discipline. Passing the exam meant entering the sacred machinery, becoming an exact piece. Not to think for oneself, but to think within the pattern. To fail meant returning to the village, to plough the land, to vanish. From the capital of Chang'an, roads stretched in all directions, with postal stations, horse messengers, detailed registers. The empire pulsed without interruptions. Each province had its numbers, its maps, its temples, its agricultural records. Bureaucrats knew how many mules were in each district, how many sacks of rice should be sent north, how many families had been born, how many had died. It was a state made of lists, of columns, of silences signed with a seal. It was also a state that knew how to trade. From the western deserts, camel caravans began to arrive. The Silk Road was not decreed. It was born by walking: looms, spices, jade, ceramics, dyes, ideas. Slowly, China extended not with armies, but with thread. And still, within all this vastness, daily life continued as always. In a remote village, a woman wove beside the fire, her hands rough, thread coiled around her wrist. Her son, seated on the packed dirt floor, softly repeated a phrase learned from his teacher. The virtue of the sage is like the wind, that of the ignorant like grass. His voice trembled, but he repeated. The sound of the loom, the scent of cooked rice, the weight of winter outside, all remained still. And in that stillness the empire lived, not in walls, not in armies, in the repeated gesture, in the copied text, in the unchanging duty. Even as the dynasty aged and the structure of the court began to warp under its own weight, even as palace intrigues festered behind silken screens and eunuchs whispered into the ears of child emperors, even as grain shipments failed to arrive on time and bandits appeared again on mountain roads once kept safe by imperial patrols, the vast and intricate machine of the Han did not simply collapse. It did not vanish like smoke. Instead, it settled slowly, deeply into the bones of the land. Its rhythms, etched into scrolls, fields, rituals, and dreams, were too deeply embedded to be undone by a single war or scandal or drought. The structure held, not with force, but with memory. The names of officers, the measurements of roads, the language of bureaucracy, these things remained in the minds of those who had lived under them. They remained in the gestures of tax collectors, in the habits of provincial governors, in the arrangement of market stalls and court etiquette and temple rites. The empire may have fractured, but the system continued to hum softly beneath the visible world, like a current beneath still water. And even when the court fell silent and the throne stood empty, even when rebel armies carved new borders into the countryside and old temples crumbled beneath moss and time, the memory of imperial rhythm remained curled inside the folds of everyday life. A mother still taught her child to bow before lighting incense. A village elder still kept records of births and harvests, even if no one asked him to. In a distant town, a schoolteacher still began the day with Confucius's words, inscribed on a wooden tablet faded by years of repetition. Bureaucrats who once served in prefectures returned to their ancestral homes, carrying scrolls and customs with them, recreating fragments of the machine in miniature, without banners, without salaries, without supervisions, simply because the pattern of order had become a kind of faith. The machine no longer needed orders from the center to operate. It had taught people to move in its rhythm, and they remembered. Now the roads are quiet. The voices of officials are gone, replaced by wind stirring through pine forests and the distant cry of cranes circling above flooded paddies. The great gates of Chang'an are closed, their red paint peeling. The halls of administration are empty, their long corridors now home to dust and echo. But the documents remain, tied with twine, neatly stacked on stone shelves, their characters intact, their ink dark against brittle parchment. Somewhere in the dark, a candle flickers briefly, and the shadows of the past stretch long across the floor. You might think the empire is gone, but listen closely. It is not. In a small home on the edge of a former province, under a roof patched with clay tiles, a boy kneels beside a table. The room is dim, lit by a single lantern whose light trembles slightly with the breeze that slips through a crack in the doorframe. The walls are bare, save for one scroll that hangs in quiet honor, its calligraphy faded, its silk mounting frayed at the edges. The boy holds a brush in his hand. The inkstone is ready. His posture is still, and with great care he begins to copy the word for virtue, tracing its long strokes slowly, not out of obligation, but from something deeper and echo that lives in his body. Even if he does not fully understand its name, he does not study to gain power. He does not study to impress. He studies because the act itself is an inheritance. The brush is not a tool. It is a thread, linking him to centuries of thought and ritual, to emperors and archivists, to farmers and sages, to the idea that order can live not in weapons or walls, but in the quiet patience of ink meeting paper. Outside, the fields wait. The seasons continue. The rhythms of planting and harvest follow the same pattern they always have. Even if the emperor no longer rules, even if the capital lies in ruin, even if the scrolls are unread and the bells are silent, the shape of the state survives, not in command, but in gesture, in breath, in the long and careful act of remembering. The machine does not need to move loudly to endure. It moves gently, like snow settling on rooftops at night, like footsteps in the corridors of memory, like a child's brushstroke stretched across silk. It sleeps, yes, but it does not forget. We arrive now in a time shaped not by conquest, but by refinement. A time where greatness no longer gallops across battlefields, but unfolds slowly, like mist across a lotus pond at dawn, settling on everything it touches with a soft, deliberate hand. The empire has not vanished. It has matured. It no longer defines itself by the reach of swords or the weight of tribute, but by the brushstroke, the stanza, the page, the song. We step into the world of the Tang and Song dynasties, where the height of civilization is not measured in fortresses or chariots, but in the quietude of scholars, in the curve of a painted mountain, in the cadence of a perfectly balanced verse. China, at this moment, becomes a landscape of texture and tone, of order woven through art, of strength made subtle. The Tang dynasty rises like a painting touched with breath and light, its borders stretching far beyond imagination, reaching into deserts, mountains, forests, and seas, absorbing peoples and customs with a grace born not of fragility but of confidence. In the capital city of Chang'an, order and abundance dwell side by side. Long avenues cut through the city like ribbons, lined with whispering willows and lanterns swaying in wind scented with tea and sandalwood. Behind heavy doors, courtyards bloom with peonies and bamboo, while priests in saffron robes chant beneath temple eaves where bells ring gently with the rhythm of prayer. Markets echo with foreign voices, a blend of Turkish, Persian, Indian, and Central Asian tongues, all seeking silk and porcelain, all bearing their own stories and spices. The empire is a meeting point, a vast and breathing mirror of the world, and it receives all of it with a measured, majestic calm. But what truly defines the Thames, and what will echo through centuries, is not conquest, but poetry. To be alive in the Thames court is to be immersed in verse, to wake and sleep with couplets in your mouth. to greet a friend with metaphor, to express politics through allegory, to mourn through illusion. Poets are not merely artists, they are officials, sages, historians, guides. The civil service exam tests not only governance, but lyricism. A man who cannot compose poetry cannot govern. A general who cannot recite the book of songs is not trusted to lead. Poetry flows through this empire as water through its rivers. It fills the minds of farmers and emperors alike, etched into bamboo, painted on fans, whispered into wine cups at dusk, and in its simplicity it holds everything: grief, desire, nostalgia, loyalty, the falling of plum blossoms on snow. Imagine, in a quiet scholar's studio, a man seated before his scroll. His robe is plain, his hair tied loosely with a cord of hemp. He holds a brush of wolf hair in his right hand and dips it into an inkstone that glows black like polished night. Outside, the rain falls with the sound of silk being folded. He writes a verse, carefully, not for publication or wealth, but to restore balance between his spirit and the world. 8 lines to capture a journey, a moonrise, a friendship lost. When he finishes, he does not read it aloud. He folds the page gently, as one might fold a memory, and places it in a lacquered box, knowing that the act of writing was enough. The empire has taught him that beauty is not in permanence, but in presence. And alongside poetry blooms painting, not as realism, but as philosophy. Artists do not seek to represent the world precisely. They paint as a form of reflection, to translate emotion into landscape, to conjure states of mind through ink and gesture. Mountains are not merely mountains. They are endurance. Waterfalls are not only gravity, they are freedom. The painter leaves much of the silk empty, because emptiness, too, is form. A scroll may show only a hut beside a stream, a fisherman casting his net in silence, a tree leaning into wind. There are no kings in these images, no wars, only a breath, suspended, a fragment of stillness made visible. As the Thames fades into fragility, undone by internal division and the weight of its own glory, the Song dynasty emerges, not with fanfare, but with depth. The song does not expand the borders of the realm, it expands the soul of the nation. Where the tanks reached outward, the song looks inward. It strengthens what lies within. Cities become centers not of control, but of culture. Bookshops open beside temples. Tea houses glow with lantern light. Artists gather not in palaces, but in pavilions by the river. Movable type printing appears. Paper currency begins to flow. Maps are drawn with precision. Clocks tick in harmony with the stars. And beneath all this, the heart of the song beats with an unshakable rhythm of thought and ritual. The scholar now becomes the ideal citizen. He is neither warrior nor merchant, but reader, writer, listener. He prepares for decades to pass the examination that grants him a role in the imperial system. Studying from dawn until the candles burn low, the civil service is no longer privilege. It is achievement through mind and memory. The government becomes a cathedral of knowledge, an edifice of principles and ink. To enter it is to prove not one's lineage, but one's alignment with harmony. Confucianism is refined into a doctrine of state. Neo-Confucian thinkers blend metaphysics and morality into vast, quiet systems of understanding. The bureaucracy becomes not a tool, but a worldview. In a modest home on the bank of a slow river, a woman prepares tea by warming the water in a clay kettle and whisking powdered leaves into emerald froth. Her son sits nearby with a scroll open on his knees, reciting verses from Sushi, his voice calm as if reading a lullaby to the air itself. Outside, cranes stand motionless among the reeds. The sky has turned the color of brushed silk. When the boy finishes the poem, the room falls into silence. No one speaks. The stillness is not empty. It is filled with meaning. The poem does not need applause. It needs to be held. Even within the court, the mood is not of domination but cultivation. The emperor is no longer merely a sovereign. He is a patron, a poet, a model of cultivated presence. He walks through gardens constructed to reflect the changing of the seasons, pausing by chrysanthemums that bloom in autumn, by pines that weather the snow. He consults with scholars not only on matters of policy, but on the correct tone for a ceremonial preface. He reads essays not to govern more efficiently, but to govern more beautifully. The state becomes a structure of language, of ethics, of curated elegance. There is power here, but it flows like ink, not like fire, and yet fragility still shadows the horizon. As the song softens inward, the world beyond its walls grows restless. Nomadic powers gather strength in the north. Armies form in steppes where horses run without fences. The military, weakened by neglect, begins to fail. And though the scrolls remain sharp, the swords dull. The end comes not suddenly, but like a painting left too long in the rain. Its lines blur, its colors fade. But that, too, has its dignity. Because, even as the dynasty declines, the memory of its grace does not vanish. Lanterns still glow in the narrow streets of southern towns. Poets still write by candlelight, their verses tucked into sleeves, their hearts still fixed on mountains and moonlight. Children still learn to bow, to write, to listen, and the rhythm of ink continues. What the song gave to China was not only stability or progress, but the deep assurance that beauty, once fully lived, can echo forever. This is a power that does not conquer with steel or fear, but reshapes the soul through softness, through presence, through the careful weaving of beauty into the structure of life itself. A power that does not scream its authority, but breathes it into being with every brushstroke. Every footstep across a polished stone courtyard, every cup of tea shared in silence beneath falling petals. It is a rule that does not impose, that does not flatten or erase, but gently invites, offering example rather than decree, cultivating harmony rather than demanding obedience. It builds not with monuments of war, but with the architecture of thought, with language crafted like woodwork, with the delicate layering of ethics and image, of tradition and renewal. And even when its era fades, and its banners are furled, and its courts emptied, what remains is not ruin, but resonance, the quiet afterimage of something deeply lived, not in glory, but in grace, a shape left in the fabric of time, like the imprint of a poem once read aloud, and then folded away in the memory of the world. Because somewhere, far from the halls of power and long after the dynasties have crumbled into stories, a child will kneel before a small wooden table worn smooth by time and touched with the quiet fingerprints of generations. And in the dim light of a flickering lamp, he will lift a brush with steady, deliberate hands. The room will be silent, save for the gentle movement of wind through paper walls and the soft breath of ink soaking into silk. He will not write to be praised. He will not write to be remembered. He will write because something ancient stirs in him, something carried through the bones of the land, through lullabies and legends, through silence and ritual. And in that moment, when the brush first meets the page, the empire of thought and feeling will rise again, not as government or edict or monument, but as a single fragile line of verse trembling into existence, a beginning that remembers everything and asks for nothing but to be written with care. There comes a moment in the long breath of history when the harmony so carefully cultivated begins to fray. Not because it was flawed, but because something vast and unsummoned arrives from beyond the known. For centuries, China had stood like a quiet mountain, shifting subtly through dynasties and reform, but always retaining its core. A love for order, for rhythm, for poetry, for the quiet dignity of balance. The empire had protected itself not only with walls of brick and stone, but with layers of memory, with traditions repeated generation after generation, with philosophies so deeply rooted they shaped not only the palace but the village, not only the emperor but the cook, the weaver, the child tracing characters in dust. But now, on the horizon, comes a different wind, dry, fast, cold, and it does not carry verse, it carries hooves and dust and the scent of steppe grass and iron. The Mongols do not come to negotiate. They do not arrive with tribute or admiration. They come with precision and power, with horses that never seem to tire and archers who shoot before breath is drawn. And yet what they do is more than conquer. They rupture. They tear through the old order with terrifying ease, and then they pause. They settle. They begin to build. The Yuan dynasty is not a Chinese dynasty in origin. It is born of the vastness of Mongolia, of Genghis Khan's sweeping vision, of Kublai Khan's ambition to hold not just land, but legacy. And in doing so, the empire is reborn in a stranger's hands. But even a stranger must plant roots where they rule. Even a wind must learn the shape of the valley it enters. So the Mongol rulers do not simply impose, they adapt. And China, with its long memory and vast quietness, begins to shape them in return. Dardu, what we now call Beijing, becomes the seat of this foreign court. And it is a city of contrasts, where steppe tents are pitched beside tiled pavilions, where foreign languages echo through streets lined with Chinese scrolls, where Persian astronomers consult with Confucian scholars, where Mongol guards drink fermented mare's milk beneath carved dragons. The empire stretches wider than ever before, from Korea to the Caspian Sea, a network of roads and messengers, of edicts and markets, of fear and fascination. The world flows through it, spices, weapons, silk, ideas. Marco Polo writes of this land in terms half factual, half enchanted, his foreign gaze capturing both the vastness and the strangeness of a place where nothing seems fixed, yet everything functions. Dardu breathes with the pulse of multiple civilizations at once, nomadic, imperial, cosmopolitan, and yet beneath its surface is a soil too ancient to forget its origins. And yet, for all its reach, the Yuan does not erase what was already here. It cannot. The empire beneath the empire persists, deep and quiet like groundwater. The Mongols rule from above, but the bureaucracy beneath remains largely Chinese. They appoint their own, but rely on those trained in the classics to record, to calculate, to manage. They ride through the corridors of power, but the bricks are still laid with calligraphy. The taxes are still counted with abacuses. The year is still marked with rites that go back 1,000 years. They attempt to impose a hierarchy of race and rank. Mongols at the top, southern Chinese at the bottom, but culture is more stubborn than policy. It does not yield to proclamation. It remains in kitchens, in ancestral shrines, in schoolrooms, in the slow ceremony of pouring tea. In a town far from the capital, a boy wakes before dawn. His family has lived here for generations, farming rice, offering prayers, copying poems on winter nights. Nothing around him bears the name of the Mongols, not the stone path to the river, not the incense ash on the family altar, not the lullabies his grandmother sings. The officials may have changed, the laws may come from a different voice, but the rhythm remains. He still bows to his elders. He still learns the same characters. He still offers oranges to the spirit of his grandfather. For him, the empire is not a map. It is a practice. And practice, once made sacred, is difficult to erase. And it is here, in these ordinary repetitions, in how one prepares tea, how one ties a sash, how one chooses silence over defiance, that the deeper China survives, not as flag or edict, but as breath, as daily devotion. And yet, memory grows restless. Scholars, once respected, now find themselves barred from positions of honor. The examination system, the very spine of the meritocratic dream, is disrupted. Many find themselves wandering, unemployed, carrying scrolls beneath their arms, teaching in private halls, writing commentaries not only on ancient texts, but on present injustice. In their essays, encoded in metaphor and classical reference, are calls for restoration, not only of political autonomy, but of cultural coherence. Resistance is born not in violence at first, but in longing, in the quiet power of remembering who one is when no one is watching. Even in exile, the soul of the literati burns, and as they write, they plant seeds of rebellion, not just against the foreign, but for the familiar. Across the land, unrest begins to flicker like lamps in wind. In one province, a tax collector is attacked. In another, a local official refuses to enforce a new law. Secret societies gather under cover of religious ritual. Peasants whisper of a coming change, of a leader who will rise not from nobility, but from suffering. And among them walks a man who had once begged on the streets, who had lived in monasteries, swept floors, worn patched robes, who had listened more than he had spoken. Zhu Yuanzhang, a man of hunger and discipline, a man shaped not by privilege, but by fire. His rebellion is not only against the Mongols, it is for the restoration of something older, the belief that the ruler must serve heaven, that the empire must be rooted in virtue, not domination. He speaks of order, but also of justice, of return, but also renewal. And thousands begin to follow him, not only because they are angry, but because they are ready to remember. But the story of his dynasty, the Ming, belongs to the next chapter. For now, we remain in this moment of dusk, the Yuan still seated, but uneasy, the streets of Dadu still bustling, but watched with suspicion, the countryside stirring, though no trumpet has sounded, and in a quiet room, lit by a single lamp, an elderly man unrolls a scroll. He has copied it many times before. The ink is familiar, the characters flow from his brush like breath, and as he writes, he is not merely preserving, he is preparing. His writing is an act of continuity, of stubborn elegance, of belief that no matter who wears the crown, the soul of a people lies in what it does when no one is looking. Because even when the empire is conquered, its spirit does not vanish. It goes underground. It becomes water. It becomes rhythm. It becomes a line of verse waiting to be spoken again. And when the snow melts, when the ground thaws, it will rise. Not with vengeance, but with memory. And when that memory takes form again, it will do so not as a shout, but as a bow, as a calligraphy brush lifted at dawn, as the steam of rice rising into a sky that has always belonged to those who remember how to kneel and how to write. The storm has passed, and from its retreat emerges not a void, but a shape, familiar, ancient, deliberate, a shape that does not scream its arrival but unfolds with slow gravity, as though time itself had bowed to continuity. The Mongol banners have fluttered their last above the palace gates, the symbols of a foreign rule drifting like exhausted birds into silence, and in the stillness that follows, in that weightless pause before a new era breathes its first, the land seems to exhale from somewhere deep within its oldest mountains. What rises now is not merely a new dynasty, not simply a new emperor on a new throne. What rises is memory made visible, tradition incarnated, rhythm restored after rupture. The Ming dynasty does not pretend to be innovation. It announces itself as a recollection. It walks forward while looking back. It builds not from ambition, but from an unbroken thread of return. China does not merely reassert its sovereignty. It retrieves its heartbeat. Zhu Yuanzhang, who becomes the Hongwu emperor, does not emerge from silk or scrolls or privilege. He rises from the fields, from famine, from dust. He is forged in suffering, shaped by long winters, walked without shoes, by the emptiness of rice bowls and the silence of monastic nights where he swept stone floors and memorized sutras in shadows. He is not crowned by lineage, but by endurance. And this makes his rule something elemental. His voice carries the grain of the people. His eyes have seen the bottom of society. When he ascends to power, it is not with the arrogance of conquest, but with the solemnity of one who has lost and remembers. His mission is not to construct an empire from glory, but to reconstruct a world that hunger had dissolved. He governs not from novelty, but from memory. His edicts echo the Confucian past, but they are spoken with the cadence of someone who has seen cities emptied by war, families scattered by tax, and temples turned to ash. His robes may be golden, but his hands recall labor. The early Ming court is a chamber of recalibration. It is not opulent, it is architectural. It is a forge rather than a feast. Governance is rebuilt, not only in structure, but in philosophy. The civil service examinations, once bruised by foreign rule, are restored with reverence and rigor. Young men across the empire kneel once again before bamboo scrolls and inkstones, their fingers trembling with the weight of expectation and belief. The classics return, not merely as curriculum, but as compass. They copy the analects line by line. They memorize the 5 classics. They are tested not just on facts, but on harmony, on the ability to think in rhythm with the ancestors, to weigh virtue as heavily as policy. These are not just officials in training. They are the veins through which the empire's thought must flow. And as the bureaucracy swells, it does not bloat. It aligns. It becomes not a machine of conquest, but a cathedral of form. Order is not only enforced, it is embodied. But the form the Ming restores is not only legal or literary, it is visual, it is spatial, it is tactile. It lives in the precise brushstroke of a character, in the curvature of a garden path, in the alignment of roofs beneath the stars. Under the Ming, aesthetics are not luxury, they are governance through beauty. A landscape scroll is not merely art, it is a diagram of stability. Mountains rise in measured proportion, rivers bend with balance. The white space between them is not emptiness, but presence. Porcelain is perfected, glazed in blue so soft it seems to hum, formed so thin it whispers when touched. These objects are not mere commodities. They are the fingerprints of an empire that speaks in silence. The court understands that culture is not accessory, it is architecture. In the great cities, life resumes with a steady, quiet pulse. The markets bloom again with silks and spices. The temples echo once more with ritual chants. The lanterns are lit in rhythm with the lunar cycle. The rice is planted in paddies as carefully as ink on a page. Calendars are consulted with precision. The stars observed. Festivals return to their full pageantry. Living in the Ming is not a political condition. It is an atmospheric one. The gestures of daily life, from bowing to the hearth to the wrapping of scrolls, form an invisible network of belonging. Yet even within this deep return, there is movement. Paper currency is refined to address inflation. Naval charts are updated. Port cities thrum with trade. And beyond the edge of the South China Sea, the empire begins to lean outward, not to colonize, but to gesture. Zheng He appears like a vision summoned from two worlds. A Muslim eunuch of immense stature and deeper loyalty, he is entrusted by the Yongle emperor to sail where few imagine possible. His ships are floating cities, their masts taller than trees, their hulls carrying porcelain, silk, and the weight of imperial dignity. His voyages do not seek to conquer. They are theatrical offerings of presence, to Arabia, to India, to Africa. Gifts are exchanged, elephants return, gold shines. But the true currency is symmetry, the idea that China has returned to itself so fully that it can extend its hand without grasping. Zheng He shows the world not strength alone, but elegance wrapped in distance. The Ming does not stay in foreign ports. It arrives, it bows, it leaves. Its message is we are whole. We do not chase, we emanate. And then the doors close, one by one, with deliberate weight, not slammed in fear, but drawn shut with the quiet finality of a dynasty turning inward, choosing containment over expansion, essence over exposure. The sails, once full and bright, are furled and stacked in storerooms that will not open again for generations, their canvas stiffening in the dark. The great archives, filled with maps and logs of faraway coasts, are sealed as if to trap the memory of salt air and foreign stars inside scrolls that no longer breathe. The court, after much calculation and ritual consultation, does not stumble into this retreat. It chooses it, not with a single decree, but through layers of policy, whispers of advisors, and a growing sense that the world beyond the walls may offer more disruption than harmony. Engagement invites instability. Contact threatens the order that has been so meticulously restored. And so the voyages cease, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well, and success, when measured against the anxiety of loss, becomes danger. The state begins to turn inward with the precision of a painter redrawing a circle not once, but over and over again, layering ink upon ink until the boundary becomes absolute, until every line aligns with a deeper ideal of perfection. What once was open becomes sealed not by force, but by intention, by the quiet conviction that safety lies in control and that the outside world, with its unpredictability and disorder, is a threat to the balance so delicately restored. Within the walls of the Forbidden City, this turn inward is expressed in every movement. Officials walk in choreographed steps, petitions are delivered according to ritualized scripts, and seasons are marked not only by stasis, but by the ceremonial repetition of offerings, of bows, of silences held for just the right length. Rituals are no longer accessories of governance. They are its spine. They do not merely accompany power, they define it. Ritual is now anchor. Repetition is no longer means, it is the message. The Ming becomes less a dynasty of momentum and more a crystallized atmosphere, a delicate lattice of meaning encased in aesthetic. A snowflake of absolute control, dazzling in its symmetry, yet so fragile that even the thought of deviation becomes dangerous. In such a system, spontaneity is not merely discouraged, it is treated like a crack in porcelain. Ceremony ascends above spontaneity. Proclamation yields to silence. The emperor appears less often, he speaks less. When he does, the words are formal, distant, refined to the point of disappearance. Power no longer flows in bold currents. It stills, it calcifies, it ossifies into posture, into form, into symmetry for its own sake. And in this frozen pose, the empire, once so vibrant in outward movement, so confident in the language of gesture and exchange, encases itself in a stillness that feels eternal. It does not fall, it hovers, suspended in ritual air, untouched, unmoved, luminous and cold. In a distant village, nestled between slow hills and surrounded by rice paddies that shimmer beneath a pale morning mist. The dynasty is not some far-off abstraction or imperial fiction. It is woven into the smallest acts of daily life, present in the scent of sandalwood incense curling toward wooden rafters, in the deliberate pacing of lessons where each word is pronounced like a drop of water placed gently on still surface, in the careful angle at which tea is poured into a porcelain cup so fine it catches the light like frost. A young boy kneels before the family altar, barefoot on the cool floor, placing 3 slender sticks of incense into the same cracked clay bowl his grandfather once used, a bowl darkened by years of silent offerings. His gestures are not instructed by voice, but by the weight of observation, by the repetition of ceremony that sinks into muscle and breath. His robe is simple, homespun, but his posture carries the grace of centuries. His mother stands behind him, quietly adjusting the folds of his garment with fingers that do not hesitate, hands that have remembered generations not through story, but through movement, through presence. This moment is not performance. It is prayer made motion. It is conviction passed down not in books, but in balance. The Ming lives in this household not by decree, but by rhythm. In the scroll that hangs above the hearth, its characters faded but intact. In the quiet space before ancestral names are spoken, a silence filled not with emptiness but with respect. In the crease of a sleeve, in the act of bowing, in the restraint of a meal shared without waste. The dynasty may reside in a distant palace, but its rhythm pulses here, in footsteps across clay, in the weight of rice bowls, in the cadence of a name spoken with care. And through these quiet acts, the empire sustains itself, not by force, not by spectacle, but by being remembered in the hands of those who live gently, deliberately, and with grace. The return of the Ming was never about dominance alone. It was not merely a shift in thrones or the replacement of one regime with another. It was about something deeper, something rooted in the marrow of the culture, the restoration of coherence, of balance, of an inner grammar by which the world could be read and understood again. It was the belief that the world, when arranged with enough precision, when tuned to the proper pitch, could hum in harmony with heaven. That roofs angled toward the sky could mirror celestial order. That thoughts disciplined by generations of study could reflect ancient virtue, and that bodies moving in careful, reverent patterns could anchor chaos and still the breathless spin of time. This was not nostalgia, it was structure. A sacred geometry lived in daily form. The Ming restored proportion not as decoration, but as principle. In architecture, in etiquette, in the curve of ceramic bowls, in the length of silences held before speech. It was the belief that beauty must be wedded to duty, that to live elegantly was not an indulgence, but a moral act, a discipline of the soul expressed in porcelain, ink, posture, and tone, that the shape of a teacup could echo the curve of a just decision, that a single brushstroke, rendered with balance and intention, might carry as much ethical weight as a law. That the calligrapher, in aligning ink with space, performed an act of social alignment, of interior symmetry. That the gardener, in arranging rocks and water and pine trees in a precise conversation of form, was not merely beautifying space, but reflecting a worldview, one that taught humility, harmony, and restraint. To serve was to shape, and to shape well was to serve deeply. And for a time, this vision held. It endured like a breath held softly between generations, like the echo of ritual steps on polished tile floors. It was not a utopia. It did not banish hunger or violence or grief. Corruption returned, as it always does, carried in human hands. Cruelty found its way into policies, its shadow cast on fields and courts. But still, the frame remained. A world arranged with care. A rhythm remembered. A life lived with attention to line and gesture, to silence and symmetry, to form and meaning. The Ming return was not a revolution in the modern sense. It was something quieter, more radical. A recollection shaped into form. A memory pressed into clay and scroll and breath, and offered to the present not as a solution, but as a place to kneel, to pause, to begin again. And when the harmony begins to fade, as all harmonies eventually do, not with a collapse, but with a soft fraying at the edges, a slow unweaving of the once tightly held fabric, the Ming does not vanish into oblivion. It leaves behind more than tombs of carved stone or cellars of porcelain or imperial edicts pressed into bamboo. It leaves a contour, an imprint, a structure that can be felt even when unseen, a remembered shape of how life could once be when it moved in rhythm with something greater than itself. A memory of balance not as fantasy but as lived architecture. A way the wind once passed over roof tiles aligned with the stars. A way the hand once wrote a name with reverence. And somewhere, perhaps far from courts and capitals, someone will remember that shape. Not entirely, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to reach toward it. To rebuild not in rebellion, not with noise or haste, but with the patience of someone who understands that true restoration is rhythm reclaimed, slow, steady, unseen at first but sure. And the rhythm paused, held like breath in the lungs of time, like silence between stanzas, like a lantern waiting for the wind will begin again. Not loudly, not with proclamation or fanfare, but gently, subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. A gesture repeated, a brush lifted, a line of verse begun in the early light. Somewhere, far from the center and closer to the soil, the rhythm will stir again in the hands of someone who remembers without knowing why. And from that small return, the whole will unfold anew. There was a moment fleeting on the scale of dynasties, but deep as the ocean, when the Chinese Empire turned not inward, but outward, and did so not with violence, but with dignity. The Ming had restored the land, secured its rituals, and rebuilt the memory of order. And in the stillness that followed, a question rose like a tide. What lay beyond the edge of the known world, and how should the empire speak to it? It was not trade alone that stirred the court, nor was it conquest. What moved the Ming to the sea was something subtler, the desire to present the restored empire not as a threat, but as an idea. The voyages that followed were not military campaigns. They were gestures, choreographed affirmations of presence, of harmony, of magnitude, as if the empire, having found its rhythm again on land, now sought to send it rippling outward across the water. Zheng He was the hand that made this gesture. He was not a prince, not a general born into privilege. He was something else, something that could only have emerged in a world as paradoxical and layered as the Ming, a Muslim born in the mountains of Yunnan, captured as a child, made a eunuch, raised within the structures of the court, and yet he became an admiral of colossal vision. His fleets were unlike anything the world had seen, floating cities with hulls broad as palaces, sails thick as woven history, and crews that spanned cultures, tongues, and religions. They carried not armies, but symbols, porcelain, silk, incense, scrolls, letters from the emperor, not demanding tribute, but offering relationship. They sailed not to subdue, but to be seen. From Calicut to Aden, from Java to Mogadishu, Zheng He brought the empire's presence as a kind of poem, vast, composed, dignified. He did not conquer. He arrived, he bowed, he returned, and the message was clear. China was not only restored, it was radiant, and yet, like all gestures, this one ended. Not with catastrophe, not with defeat, but with an inward folding silence, a silence so total it seemed to absorb the very sound of sails returning to shore. The fleets that once stretched across the Indian Ocean with confidence and ritual turned back, one by one, their hulls groaning softly under the weight of memory. The ships that had carried silk, porcelain, and presents were dismantled or left to decay, their timbers greying beside still harbours. The sails, once luminous in sunlight, were rolled and stored where light no longer reached, stacked beside crates of maps that would never again be unrolled. The sea, once imagined as a stage, a scroll, a mirror for empire, now retreated into metaphor. It was no longer named in policy, only in poems, in stories told under breath, in sighs remembered by old sailors who walked the docks with empty hands. No invader had pressed against the coast, no battle had been lost. What had changed was not the world, but the empire's gaze. A shift in posture, imperceptible at first, then total. The decision to end the voyages was not dramatic. It was procedural, a paper trail of restraint, a slow, reverent retreat written in ink. The ministers spoke of cost, of vulnerability, of the need for focus, of the threat of moral erosion that contact might bring. And so the court, anxious to preserve what had been so carefully restored, turned away from the horizon. It was not fear that closed the ocean. It was caution shaped into ideology. The world beyond was reimagined, not as a place of learning or exchange, but as a source of disorder, of unpredictability, of imbalance. And thus, the great maritime vision was folded shut, like a fan after ceremony. The shipyards were abandoned. The maps, so carefully drawn, were shelved and left to fade. The ocean, once resonant with ritual and movement, fell into absence again, not empty, but unopened. What followed was not collapse, not an explosion of disorder or a dramatic unraveling, but a quiet, careful folding inward, a measured act of preservation disguised as retreat. It was as if the empire, after extending its arms across the seas, now sought to draw every fingertip back to its chest, to shelter its breath and pulse in the stillness of ritual. The state, once open to the rhythm of the ocean, began to enclose itself in form, in the geometry of courts, in the sequence of ceremonies, in the recitation of procedure. The great energy that had propelled ships across vast water was not lost, but redirected, channeled into the strict geometry of palace corridors, into the metronomic passage of officials through tiled courtyards, into the mathematical perfection of processions. Walls thickened, scripts multiplied. Every gesture was codified, every utterance weighed. Rituals once performed with luminous spontaneity became rigid, almost liturgical, repeated with increasing precision until meaning itself seemed trapped beneath the surface. Ambassadors no longer ventured toward foreign lands. They bowed at court, reciting speeches written generations ago. Where once explorers studied stars and tides, now historians catalogued protocol. The empire, still radiant, turned luminous not with curiosity, but with control. It no longer opened to the world like a flower to the sun, but mirrored its own image back upon itself, a reflection trapped in ceremonial glass. The sea, once painted as a canvas of destiny, was no longer part of the narrative. It had become a silence, not absent, but erased, as if its presence had been folded into memory so thoroughly that even its salt had evaporated from the air. But no silence is ever complete. Beneath the stillness, the sea remembered. In villages along the southern coast, old sailors spoke in the hush of dusk, of strange cities where the call to prayer echoed through red stone alleys, of elephants with gold-draped backs, of the stars that guided them past the edge of known maps. They passed these stories not in books, but in whispers, in gestures, in the weaving of sails that no longer lifted. In inland markets, merchants handled foreign beads whose origin they could not name. On painted scrolls, tucked into court chambers, were giraffes rendered with the awe of myth. Memory persisted. It lingered in objects, in dreams, in the silence between official lines. And still, the court remained closed, not by accident, but by conviction. External engagement was now seen not as expansion, but as erosion. Stability required containment. Purity required caution. The empire did not collapse. It ossified, not like a building broken by wind, but like a sculpture sealed in glass, untouched, unmoved, ever polished. And yet, even glass cracks, the rituals grew dense. The policies layered themselves into impenetrable walls. The Ming no longer listened. It recited. It no longer reached. It recoiled. Still, the sea waits, not impatiently, but with the vast, unmeasured patience of something that has seen empires rise and dissolve like foam. The stars remain, their constellations unchanged, still hovering in the same configurations that once guided the helmsman of Zhenghi's great fleets. And the waves, gentle now, still brush against the stone piers and silent ports where those ships once moored like floating palaces, their sails unfurled like silken prayers rising into the wind. The ocean does not vanish. It does not protest. It simply waits, breathing in rhythm with the moon, storing memory in its tides. It dreams, not in images, but in currents, in salt, in the deep pull of return. And in quiet rooms, far from the palaces and beyond the scroll-lined chambers of scholars, someone still listens. A child holds a seashell to their ear and hears not only the echo of waves, but something older, a rhythm, a presence, a breath. Someone draws a ship in the dust with the tip of a twig, not knowing its name, but knowing its shape by instinct. And in that fragile gesture, that tracing of hull and sail, the memory stirs. It is not gone. It has not failed. It waits, in fragments, in shadows, in the space between ritual and dream. Someone, somewhere, still listens for that rhythm, the one that once crossed water not to conquer, but simply to be known and to know in return. And when that rhythm stirs again, it will not come as noise or as thunder, not with drums nor declaration. It will rise like the morning mist over forgotten harbors, like breath drawn between stanzas of a poem left unfinished. It will come softly, like canvas lifting in a wind no one ordered but everyone remembers. The rhythm will stir in gestures first, in the turning of a head toward the horizon, in a line of verse rediscovered, in the sudden silence before a question. And presence, long delayed but never extinguished, will return not with spectacle, but with a deep familiarity, like the echo of footsteps in a corridor once walked, like the scent of sea salt in a breeze that comes through a window long closed. It will be not an arrival, but a reawakening, not a conquest, but a remembering. And in that quiet movement, the empire will touch the ocean once more. The fall of a dynasty does not begin with fire. It begins in silence, not the brief hush before a storm, but a silence that settles over decades like dust on lacquered wood, creeping into spaces once alive with motion. It is not the silence of reverence, nor the silence of peace, but the silence of something held too long, too tightly. A quiet so thick it begins to press against the bones of ritual, to gather in the lungs of ministers as they speak with voices drained of conviction, to echo in the hollow pauses between proclamations that no longer stir the heart of the empire. The Ming did not end in a single, dazzling catastrophe. It unraveled in slow spirals of form and gesture. Like a scroll forgotten in sunlight and wind, its edges lifting, its characters fading one stroke at a time until only the pattern remained. Fragile, beautiful, and empty. This was an empire that had once extended its presence far beyond its shores, that had once launched fleets as poems across the sea, grand expeditions woven from silk and intention, carrying gifts instead of armies, seeking not conquest but recognition, the acknowledgement of a center so vast and composed that it could afford to reach outward in grace. It had inscribed its presence across waters, with sails like calligraphy and timbers humming with ritual. And yet, not so many generations later, that same empire had come to fear even the idea of movement. What had once been gesture turned into recoil. The horizon became a rumor, the sea a mirror turned inward. It had looked inward for so long that the outside became inconceivable, its meaning dissolved into abstraction. The dynasty that had once restored memory with precision, that had carved time into architecture, that had infused stone and ceremony with rhythm and direction, that same lineage now found itself, unable to breathe outside of ceremony's grasp. It could still speak, but only in repetition. It could still move, but only along predetermined lines. The weight of its perfection, once a source of splendor, had become its prison. Its ritual, once vibrant, became mechanical. Its forms, once elegant and fluid, became brittle with their own self-importance. What was once rhythm, musical, spontaneous, full of breath, hardened into a beat too strict to dance to, and what had been form, reflective, generative, responsive, collapsed under the pressure of its own expectations, becoming rigid, ornamental, hollow. The fall began here, not with flames, not with invaders, but with a stillness so immovable that it could no longer respond, a perfection so absolute that it had forgotten how to bend without breaking. The court still performed its ceremonies, more elaborate now than ever, cloaked in a kind of desperation, as if the perfection of ritual could still summon meaning, could still hold together what the body of the state had already begun to forget. The robes grew heavier, dyed deeper, stitched with dragons that no longer soared. The bows performed in audience halls deepened until they bent not toward respect, but toward exhaustion. Silence, once a sign of reverence, became a shield against decision. Within the forbidden city, where every hallway echoed with echoes, the emperor moved behind layers of protocol, behind silk screens, behind generations of habit. Ministers met in rooms filled with incense and worry, debating not the fate of the people, but the angle of a brushstroke on an edict. or the correct pronunciation of ancient titles. The machinery of governance still turned, but no longer knew what it was meant to move. Beyond the red lacquered gates, where the walls of the forbidden city rose high and impenetrable, the land began to tremble, not in an instant, but over seasons, over years. It was not a sudden shattering, it was a long loosening, a slow erosion of the foundations that had once held the empire together like joined beams. It began in the fields, where farmers who had once chanted poems while planting rice now stood in silence, watching parched soil split open like cracked porcelain. It continued in the roads, where once caravans had passed bearing tribute and scrolls. But now weeds grew in the ruts left by carts that no longer came. Granaries once overflowing now echoed with emptiness, first from drought, then from floods, and finally from absence. The sky no longer offered answers, only indifference. The prayers that once rose like incense now fell flat, whispered by mouths too dry from hunger to shape words with hope. In village after village, the rhythm of agriculture fractured. Rice paddies dried into dust or drowned beneath unseasonable rains. Families dug for roots, then for weeds, then for nothing. The famine that arrived did not trumpet its coming. It crept in like fog, like shadow, like a silence that settled into stomachs. It lingered in the bones, in the breath, in the quiet sobs of parents watching their children sleep without dreams. It whispered rebellion, not in ideology, but in necessity. It called not for change of dynasty, but for bowls of millet, for one more harvest. And slowly the hunger took shape, not as riots, but as migration, not as battle, but as desertion. The temples, once filled with kneeling supplicants, stood empty. The people who had bowed to emperors now gathered in forests, in caves, in rumor. They did not call for vengeance, they called for bread. They rose not to conquer, but to survive. And yet within the palace walls, the center did not stir. It calcified. The rituals continued. The music played. The deliberations grew longer. The words spoken by ministers became more ornate, more hollow. The court, lost in the ceremony of itself, could no longer hear the language of suffering that echoed beyond its doors. It was not indifference, but deafness born from too many years of looking only inward. The countryside was stirring like a vast body waking from paralysis, but the empire had forgotten how to move. The mandate of heaven, once a living breath in the rhythm of empire, had become a title repeated too often to be believed. And when the enemy approached, it did not march with chaos. It advanced with patience. The Jurchen, then the Manchu peoples forged in the cold northern frontier, in long winters and endless winds, watched and waited. Their strength was not in scale, but in momentum. Where the Ming hesitated, they moved. Where the empire paused, they pressed forward. They arrived not only with weapons, but with vision, with order, with a promise of restored clarity. And in the spring of 1644, when the gates of the capital finally opened and the dynasty breathed its last as sovereign, what echoed was not a cry of resistance, but a kind of hollowed quiet. The empire did not fall. It exhaled. But even as the banners changed, something lingered. In the halls of the forbidden city, dust settled slowly across golden beams. In the gardens once tended by silent eunuchs, plum blossoms still fell in spring. In southern provinces, loyalists lit incense before altars bearing the names of emperors now gone, not to raise armies, but to preserve memory, in verse, in ink, in silence. A rhythm survived even as the music stopped, not in policy, not in war, but in the hands of those who remembered how to bow, how to write, how to wait. The fall of the Ming was not a crash, it was a slowing of breath, a loss of movement. An empire so perfectly arranged it could no longer adapt, so saturated with form it could no longer feel. The very order that had once brought renewal became rigidity, and rigidity, in time, breaks. And yet, in that breaking, that long, slow unraveling of a world once wound so tightly it could no longer breathe, something remains. Not in the palace archives, nor in the records of conquest or defeat, but in the quieter spaces history overlooks. In the ash of the final offering, a warmth lingers, faint but enduring, like the last glow of incense long extinguished. In the silence that follows the final bow, the final bell, the final brushstroke, there is still a breath being held, as if time itself cannot quite let go. And within the hearts of those who remember not only the names, but the rhythm, the precise cadence of footsteps across worn stone paths, the ritual pause before a line of verse is spoken aloud, the weight of porcelain cupped gently in the palm, like a small, remembered moon. Something waits. It does not seek power. It does not call for thrones. It waits not for triumph, but for return. A return of rhythm, of balance, of gesture. It is not continuity in the sense of lineage or crown, but in the persistence of form, the subtle memory of how things once flowed, how order once hummed through movement and silence alike. It is a remembering not of empire, but of essence. And in that quiet, unwavering memory, something endures, steady, patient, poised for the day it might be shaped into motion again. Because, even as it ends, even as the palace doors close, the incense fades, and the banners are folded into silence. The Ming leaves behind a shape, not of politics or conquest, but of how stillness once held meaning, of how ceremony once carried breath, of how time could be woven into beauty. It leaves behind a silhouette in the dust, a curve in the garden wall, a phrase in the calligrapher's final stroke, and from that shape, quiet, incomplete, but persistent, something will rise again, not in imitation, but in resonance, not as replication, but as echo. And that echo, drawn from memory and carried forward by hands that still remember the rhythm, will take form once more, gentle, unannounced, but inevitable. When the Qing came, they came not only as conquerors, but as observers, as listeners, as careful students of a civilization older and deeper than their own. They arrived not with the roar of fire and the clang of chains, but with the hush of intention, bearing folded maps inked with restraint, not ambition. Their approach was not to tear down, but to step softly, to place their feet inside the prints left by those who came before. They crossed the Great Wall not to dismantle what lay beyond it, but to enter it like one steps into a vast echoing temple, with reverence, caution, and a quiet need to belong. They were Manchu, and they did not pretend otherwise. They carried with them the scent of northern pine, the clipped syllables of a foreign tongue, the strength of riders shaped by snow, wind, and the silence of the frontier. Their customs were not Chinese, but neither were they hostile. They came from the steppes, wrapped in furs, mounted on horses whose breaths steamed in the cold dawn. They came bearing difference, but in the face of China's immensity, its rivers, its classics, its painted roofs and ancient scrolls, they chose not rupture, but reflection. They chose to hold up a mirror, to attempt not to remake, but to replicate, to reproduce the gesture, the form, the breath, because they understood a truth deeper than strategy or strength, that the soul of China resided not merely in borders or names, but in rhythm, in ritual, in the way silence was held and brush met paper, in the shape of the past preserved through form. The Qing did not tear down the forbidden city. They stepped into its silence with care, allowing its red walls and golden tiles to remain not only as architecture, but as memory, as continuity incarnate, as symbols not of conquest but of delicate inheritance. They did not march through its gates as destroyers, but entered as readers of a vast and unfinished book, one whose margins were filled with custom, with gesture, with centuries of breath held between proclamations. The air still smelled of incense and lacquer, of rain on stone. The chambers still echoed with the voices of the Ming, not loudly, but insistently, like the memory of a poem once learned by heart. The Qing did not wish to overwrite that voice. They wished to harmonize with it. They did not erase the ancient bureaucracy, whose scrolls and seals had governed the empire for centuries with a logic more ceremonial than legal, more poetic than pragmatic. They stepped into it, not as revolutionaries, but as careful apprentices, allowing the vast machinery of Chinese administration, its rituals, its cadences, its invisible architecture of respect to keep turning, not because they were blind to its complexity, but because they understood that in China, to govern was not merely to command, but to move in rhythm with history. They bowed as the Ming had bowed, tracing the arc of gesture with reverent precision, adjusting their breath to the long, slow exhale of dynasty. Their robes, stitched in familiar patterns, did more than clothe them. They translated them. In silk, in color, in fold and drape, the Qing became legible to those they ruled. Legitimacy was not only declared, it was worn. They learned the Confucian canon, not out of vanity, but out of necessity, because in China, the emperor did not simply rule by decree, but by example, by moral resonance, by the harmonization of word and form. They governed a people whose sense of identity was as much aesthetic as it was ancestral, a people for whom a miswritten character, an improperly timed ritual, or an ill-composed edict could fracture the delicate trust that held the empire together. The Qing learned not just to speak Chinese, they learned to breathe it, to walk in its rhythms, to thread themselves into its poetic logic. They moved through calligraphy, ceremony, etiquette, and architecture not as tourists, but as students who understood that legitimacy was not only seized, it was performed. And in return, they were permitted to remain. Not always embraced, not always celebrated, but accepted within the bounds of continuity. The people watched, measured, evaluated, and what they saw, most of all, was reflection. Not invention, but inheritance, worn with care. The Qing did not claim to be origin, they claimed to be vessel. And because they knew how to mirror, they endured. And so the empire continued. The rites resumed. The fields were planted. The scholars studied. Kangxi compiled dictionaries. Yongzheng issued reforms with calligraphic clarity. Qianlong painted his admiration in scrolls and palaces, composing poems in Chinese, commissioning art that looked back even as it claimed the present. The examination system persisted. The mandarins, draped in black gauze and red coral buttons, recited the same verses their grandfathers had. Porcelain flowed from Jingdezhen. Incense rose in ancestral halls. And through it all, the Qing ruled not by force alone, but by reflection. They held up the mirror of the Ming, polished it, honored it, and in doing so, cast themselves not as invaders, but as stewards. But mirrors do not innovate, they preserve. And in time, preservation turned to performance. The reflection grew brittle. The scholars, bound to centuries-old texts, ceased to see the ground beneath their feet. The rituals remained perfect, but empty. The court, still grand, became distant, its voice muffled by the echo of its own formality, while the world beyond China surged forward, with railways, factories, treaties written in steel and steam. The Qing continued to bow, to compose, to recite. They mistook continuity for immunity. They believed that to reflect the past was to survive the future. But the mirror, no matter how lovingly polished, cannot shape what lies ahead. And yet, even in this failure, a failure not of collapse, but of stillness, of repetition without reinvention, there was grace, a quiet, measured grace that did not shout, but sustained. The Qing did not destroy what they could not transform. They did not dismantle temples or erase the calligraphy of previous reigns. Instead, they walked through history as through a garden at dusk, touching what they did not build with a gentleness born of deep, conscious restraint. They did not burn libraries. They copied them, character by character, as though each stroke carried breath. They did not silence the poets. They quoted them in imperial edicts, wove their lines into the margins of scrolls, echoed their cadences in the rhythms of official speech. They did not dissolve the shape of the Chinese world, the rituals, the rhythms, the invisible architecture of etiquette and cosmology. They carried it, not like conquerors, but like monks bearing sacred vessels through a storm. Their rule was not radiant, not flamboyant with invention or alight with modernity, but it was careful, it was durable. It was built not to dazzle, but to preserve, to carry forward what was inherited, even as time shifted beneath their feet. Not visionary, perhaps, but enduring, and in that endurance, something profound survived. Not the empire itself, which would fracture and fall, as all empires do, but the continuity of gesture, the subtle choreography of tradition, the way things moved, were spoken, were bowed to, were brewed and poured, were held. They preserved not the world, but the way of being within it. And even now, in the corridors of old academies, in the dust of porcelain kilns, in the dry pages of imperial ledgers, the Qing still linger, not as conquerors, not as heroes, but as custodians of reflection. Their mirror, though cracked, still catches light, and in that light we do not see them. We see what they preserved, because sometimes to rule a civilization is not to change it, not to carve it anew or dress it in foreign robes, but to carry its echo, gently, steadily, through time, like a vessel passed from hand to hand, unbroken, to hold its shape even when the meaning fades, to walk in its rhythm even when the drumbeat slows, to repeat its gestures not out of habit but out of faith, and in doing so, to protect the breath that waits within the breath of memory, of continuity, of renewal, until, one day, it stirs again, quietly, and begins to speak once more in its own voice. China did not awaken from its dynastic past like someone rising from a dream. It did not leap into modernity with a single breath or declaration. It shifted, gradually, unevenly, like sediment settling into a riverbed, like ink spreading across rice paper, like a bell's vibration long after the sound is gone. The transformations were quiet, almost imperceptible at first. A courtyard that once held incense and ancestors became a train station marked by LED screens. A shrine once lit by candles became a school with textbooks printed in bold fonts. A scroll, brushed by a scholar in solitude, became a screen lit from within. But beneath the steel and glass, beneath the electric wires and concrete scaffolding, something older continued to pulse, something without name or border, something shaped by breath and gesture. It did not persist as relic, nor as ruin, but as rhythm, as pulse, as grammar carried in the body. The past did not disappear. It bent, folding inward like silk robes placed in a lacquered chest. It softened its voice, but not its presence. It wrapped itself in the ordinary. It threaded itself into the seams of everyday life, so quietly, so intimately, that even those who lived inside it did not always notice. It remained in the way tea is poured, not rushed, not cold, but with pause and temperature and care. It lived in the moment when one waits to speak, letting silence do its work. In the brief hesitation before crossing a doorway, where something unspoken still governs motion. These gestures survived, not because they were recorded or enforced, but because they were absorbed into the wrist. The breath, the glance, never truly forgotten, because they were never truly separate from being. The revolution came, then another, and another, and with each came new flags that fluttered above old rooftops, new slogans painted over old walls, new uniforms stitched from different fabric, but worn by bodies that still remembered. Maps were redrawn, songs rewritten, statues removed and replaced, yet the body remembered. The hand, trained over generations, still moved in the arc of brushstroke passed down like a reflex. The voice still softened unconsciously when naming the dead, as though loss had a ritual cadence that outlasted doctrine. A grandmother, living in a high-rise lit by fluorescent bulbs, placed incense on a plastic table with the same reverence her mother once showed before a carved altar. A construction worker, leaning against steel scaffolding, quoted a line from the Analects without knowing its name, without knowing it had once been whispered in palace halls. A Thames poem lived, half transformed, in the gold-lettered calligraphy above a noodle shop. Its verse shortened to fit the sign, but still balanced in breath and line. In the courtyard of a government building, a pine tree curved just so, not planted for politics, but for symmetry, for memory, for the unspoken logic of placement that no policy could invent. The past did not shout. It hummed, low and steady, beneath the anthem, beneath the speech, beneath the noise of megaphones and engines. It moved not in defiance, but in undercurrent, like breath beneath silk, like rhythm in the bones, like a hand reaching for the teacup before it spills, without thought, but with centuries of instinct behind it. Even in the cities, where towers rise like metal incantations, the past walks softly, threading itself between shadows cast by neon lights, in the hush of early morning street sweepers, in the gestures of vendors arranging their stalls in the same order their parents once did. A high-speed train glides across land that once bore imperial envoys on horseback, and though its engine hums with modern precision, it follows routes not unlike those traced by ancient scrolls. A touchscreen glows in a restaurant where, just outside, red lanterns swing in wind that smells of sesame oil and rain, echoing the old marketplaces where voices once rose in a symphony of bargaining and storytelling. The skyscrapers themselves, steel-clad and luminous, lean like modern pagodas, their uppermost corners angled with a quiet reverence, their forms unknowingly paying tribute to structures that stood for balance, for orientation, for harmony with the sky. Their silhouette in twilight is not unlike that of ancient watchtowers, watching, remembering. The architecture may be different, but the instinct is the same, to shape space with meaning, to climb, not only in ambition, but in reverence. Their corners turn upward like forgotten prayers, not because anyone commanded it, but because form remembers what the mind no longer holds. The past in China does not announce itself. It has no need for proclamation. It survives as arrangement in the alignment of objects, the order of gestures, the shape of a room. It is cadence, the unspoken tempo of daily life, how a sentence rises and falls, how one listens before answering. It is mood, not sentimentality, but a feeling folded into the folds of fabric, into the warmth of soup, into the timing of a pause. It lives in the way silence is held before a speech, not as hesitation, but as architecture. It lingers in the way rice is scooped, carefully, deliberately, with a weight that recalls both famine and plenty. It endures in the fact that doors still face certain directions, not because anyone demands it, but because harmony still whispers in the compass. It is not simply memory, but a structure of feeling, a scaffolding of invisible instincts, passed from generation to generation through repetition and grace. It is not always visible, but it is always carried, like posture, like music felt in the chest, like the breath held before writing a name. The dynasties have ended, the thrones dismantled, the court rituals are no longer performed, but they have not died. They slipped into the body, into how one sits, waits, welcomes, mourns. Their rituals seeped into movement, into timing, into tone. Their philosophies whispered into syntax, the way obligation and beauty can coexist in a single phrase. Their balance etched into the very contour of how a thought becomes form. The empire was buried, but the rhythm was not. It remains beneath the dust, beneath the surface, beneath the language, still instructing, still shaping, still breathing. And so modern China is not a break. It is not a clean departure, not a severed line, but a layering, soft, complex, continuous. It is Ming beneath metro lines, the hum of trains echoing through soil where imperial footsteps once pressed. It is tense beneath traffic lights, the pause and rhythm of crossing resembling the meter of ancient verse. It is song beneath schools, the classroom's chalk dust swirling like powdered ink, the repetition of memorized phrases echoing the cadence of scholars once bent over bamboo scrolls. It is the brushstroke beneath the LED sign, a curve of light shaped by the ghost of calligraphy. It is the poem beneath the party slogan, its cadence shaped by rhythms far older than ideology. It is the ancestor behind the ID number, their lineage not listed, but felt in posture, in silence, in the way a name is spoken during festivals. The country moves fast, with escalators and engines, networks and screens, but not without memory. Its velocity pulses over roads paved atop footpaths once walked by philosophers. It builds, with glass and steel, ambition and invention, but not without echo. The scaffolding of its future rises from foundations that were never erased, only built upon, absorbed into the layers of time like sediment pressed into stone. The skyscraper, all glass and brilliance, still casts a shadow shaped like a pagoda, its corners reaching skyward in a gesture that once belonged to prayer. A satellite beam arcs over a temple courtyard where incense still burns in the early morning, fragrant, quiet, unresolved, and a new anthem, bright, forceful, forward-looking, is still sung with an old cadence, its intervals carried not by policy, but by breath-long trained in ancient rhythm, because here history does not pass like a storm or a season. It does not vanish or complete itself. It continues, like breath, like music, like a path walked daily, until it becomes a part of the earth. It loops, not in repetition, but in return, in echo, in quiet reappearance, where one least expects it. It exhales, not with force, but with patience, moving softly through gestures, through pauses, through the curve of a sentence spoken without knowing it holds centuries. It lingers in the weight of objects, in the silence between rituals, in the way the future arrives, already shaped by what preceded it. Here, history is not past. It is texture, it is air. It is rhythm pressed into the clay of the everyday. And in the quiet places, in the subtle pause before a child answers a teacher, where hesitation is not ignorance but respect, in the precise, practiced way a shopkeeper counts change, not only as transaction but as rhythm learned over years, in the deliberate curve of a garden behind an office tower, where stone and moss still conspire to echo a forgotten philosophy, it breathes, not with urgency, but with constancy. It breathes in the folds of routine, in the pauses between movement, in the unnoticed choreography of daily life. It does not need to be named to be felt. It does not require recognition to remain alive. It breathes like an old song hummed unconsciously, like incense curling upward in an empty room. Still, the past is not behind, it is below. It is folded into stone and syllable, into motion and pause. It is stitched into the hem of a uniform, held in the breath before a greeting, carved into the angles of a gate that opens inward. It does not fade. It deepens. It waits. It becomes the silence that carries meaning between words. And it is not done speaking. It whispers in gestures. It murmurs in timing. It sings, not in songs we recognize, but in the rhythm of how one lives among memory. It is still here, still breathing, still becoming, still rising through smoke curled from offerings left in quiet corners of kitchens, still pulsing beneath fingertips that trace old characters on walls newly painted, still drifting through corridors where voices echo the cadence of ancient rhythms. It does not return with fanfare. It does not need a name to speak. It lingers like warmth on stone after sunset, like dust suspended in late light, like history waiting, not for permission, but for stillness. And so you may rest now, with the story gathered not in chronology, but in presence, as rhythm, as gesture, as silence folded into breath. Close your eyes, let the scroll roll shut, let the incense burn out slowly, let the past hold you not as weight, but as rhythm, and sleep, deep, slow, with all of China dreaming just beneath your feet. So now we return, not to a beginning, nor to an end, but to a stillness shaped by breath. You have wandered through scrolls and shadows, through dynasties folded in silence, through rivers that remember names long erased from maps. You have listened to voices once spoken only in ritual, and walked with footsteps that pressed into soil layered by centuries. The story, like all stories worth keeping, continues, not in lines, but in circles, not in conquest, but in echo, not in victory, but in the quiet choreography of memory. Close your eyes now. Let the rhythm of history soften around you. Let the sound of mountains drift into your breath. Let the pages turn inward. In the gesture of a bowed head, there is an empire. In the pause before pouring tea, there is a century. In the curve of a gate, there is a philosophy still listening. You are not outside of history. You are resting inside it. Let it hold you. Let it deepen. Let it disappear into the hush where memory becomes form. Because sometimes sleep is the only way to carry the weight of time, and dreams, slow, unhurried dreams, are where rhythm returns without asking, good night. Rest gently. Let the echoes find you. And may the breath of all that came before walk beside you until the next story begins.